So welcome everyone who's joining us today for our second webinar of the Medical Datathon webinar series. We're really excited for the speakers that we have speaking today. In case you missed me last time, my name is Steph and I'll be emceeing all of these webinars as well as the Datathon that we have running on the weekend. So I work for Datawi, which is Kelvin Ross's company. If you were able to tune into the webinar on Monday, where Kelvin Ross spoke along with Brent Richards, we do have that recording being posted onto the Queensland AI Hub website if you missed it and you want to catch up on that one. So today I have the honour of introducing two excellent speakers. First, I'll introduce our first speaker and we will hear from her for 20 minutes and then we'll have a 5-minute Q&A. So I encourage you to post your questions in the chat. If you want to post them publicly, that would be great. And we'll just have 5 minutes at the end to answer those questions and then we'll move on to our next speaker. So today we have Distinguished Professor Kerrie Mengersen from Queensland University of Technology. She's going to talk to us about rethinking clinical trials, a data-centric discussion. So Kerrie Mengersen is a statistician and director of the Centre for Data Science at Queensland University of Technology. She's Deputy Director of the ARC Medical Centre for Mathematical and Statistical Frontiers, Big Data, Big Models and New Insights. Kerrie is an elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, the Australian Social Sciences Academy and the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences. As an ARC Laureate Fellow, she works on the development and application of methods for using diverse types of data to learn about complex systems and problems in health, the environment and industry. She's currently working with international teams to use data science to gain insights into national and international dynamics of COVID-19. So we'll hand over to you, Kerrie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for that introduction and hello everybody. So I'll just share my screen. Give me a second. Can you see my screen?
Yes, excellent.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about clinical trials and from a data-centric perspective. So I'm a statistician, do data analysis and data science, and so it's very natural for me, of course, to be talking about these trials from a data-centric perspective, recognizing, of course, that there's a lot of other perspectives as well with respect to the clinical and the social aspects of trials. So I'll be focusing more on just the design of the trials, the data analysis and so on, and perhaps those other aspects can be talked about in the discussion. So I'd like to start, just if I can get this going. So with acknowledgements, so the two areas the two centres, the concentrations of expertise at QUT in data science is through our Centre for Data Science and the connections that we have across the university in concentrations of expertise in areas related to data science. So through the social media research group, through health, through business, through engineering, and so on. And so bringing together those different perspectives on data science, combining with the maths, the stats and the computer science to really concentrate on being able to deliver for the various aspects of data collection, data management, data integration, data communication, and data uptake. And then alongside that, we have our Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence in Mathematical and Statistical Frontiers. And so here we're bringing together different nodes, universities around the country. So there's 7 universities bringing together math, stats, machine learning in the areas of healthy people, sustainable environments and prosperous societies. In our data science at QUT network and the Centre for Data Science at QUT, we're also founded the Australian Data Science Network. And so this is connecting different centres of data science in universities around the country. And we're really, really pleased to be collaborating with the Queensland AI Hub to bring together these different perspectives of data science, AI, statistics, computer science, to really form this really strong concentration of expertise in Queensland and in Australia. So having said all of that, coming back then to the question of clinical trials, and we think about medicine in general, and why do we need clinical trials, and how far have we come in understanding about medicine? And we can see from this slide here, this is the past. And so we look at all the different ways that we used to understand health and medicine in the past, and even pre-trials. So if we think about why do we need trials? Well, we know that these kinds of, past concoctions, we might call them, were the medicine of the past. And so we have, for example, medication that was based on cocaine, on heroin. There were leeches, which of course are still part of the medical practice today. There was electrotherapy. There were lobotomies that were conducted, and so on. So all of these kinds of concoctions, and even you think of cocaine, which in the past was actually seen to be such a great salve and medication. So you had the Pope that actually gave a medal to this Vin Mariani wine because it was so popular. And so you had Edison and Freud and Queen Victoria, who all thought these were marvelous remedies. Well, how do we know that these kinds of remedies work in the past or even now in the future, new remedies that have come up? Well, part of what we have to think about is what is the actual relationship between the remedy and the effect? And this idea of cause and effect was something that some of our philosophers in the past have really thought about, and the current philosophers as well. So David Hume was a very influential person in the 18th century who talked about causation and how we might understand causation. And this is still a point of debate today. So even about causation in a population, looking at the remedy and then the effect in a population versus in an individual. And so this is very much a point of philosophy, but then very much a point of medicine as well. And we go then to Ronald Fisher, who really set the framework for experimental design, and was one of the scientists who really, the statisticians, who really set out how we might conduct experiments and trials to learn about these causal effects. So the randomized controlled trial that was part of this experiment, a very large base of experimental designs, is the foundation for the medical trials that we conduct today. So we take a randomization, which means that we're going to split a population into 2 or more groups randomly, and then we're going to have an intervention in one of those groups and a control in the other group, and then we're going to observe the outcomes and compare those between the 2 groups. So the overall randomized controlled trial then can be set out, as you can see in this slide here, as the assessment for eligibility. We randomize, we allocate to the intervention, we then follow those patients through or subjects through, and then we do the analysis. Randomized controlled trials are, as I said, the foundation of our clinical trial system, and reviews and libraries and repositories such as the Cochrane repository really speak to the number of trials that are conducted throughout the world. So you can see on the right of the screen here that even just in the Cochrane library, the number of trials that have been added to the repository in the last year, 2 years, in the last 3 months. So a lot of work. And in Australia, we have, for example, one of the groups, the Australian New Zealand clinical trial repository as well. So a lot of work in clinical trials, a lot of work in Australia and globally. So randomized clinical trials are the gold standard. They provide this very strong base for being able to understand if we randomize, we believe that we're more free of bias. We believe that there's a balance in the control group and the treatment group, And then we hope then that by doing that randomization, we can take out the effect of any other kind of variables that might be impacting on the outcome. And then that will just leave us with the treatment as being at the differentiator between the respondents, and so between the groups. And so then when we look at the comparison of the respondents, we'll be able to attribute that to the treatment. Randomized controlled trials then have a very strict structure. They're prospective, they have a pre-specified design, they have a specified hypothesis, they're supposed to be free of bias, so they're blind. In other words, the person who's randomizing it, or the mechanism that's doing the randomization, doesn't know which group the people are going in. It's completely random. And then the people who are making the evaluation of the outcome are also don't know which groups these people are in, so they can't bias their decision. There's no peaking on the way through a randomized trial, so you have to carry the trial out until the end. And there are pre-specified analyses, and it's well-defined outcomes. But often that doesn't work. And in many cases, if you think of orthopedics, for example, I talked at an orthopedics conference, and the kind of trials that you want to do for orthopedics and many other areas don't fit into the kind of randomized control framework. People want to change groups. People will wake up one morning and feel like they don't want to be in the trial anymore, or they don't want the operation. It's very difficult to blind the experiment. There are outcomes that are beyond the duration of the trial. And so many problems like this, many contexts, don't fit into these randomized control trials. So what are the options? Well, let's talk about design. We have these experimental studies, randomized controlled trials. We can have other kinds of controlled trials, and we can also then have observational studies. And these are not trials, but a different kind of concept where we take a population and then we draw from that population, either look at amongst that population, how many people have the treatment, and then or have the outcome, and then look at those with respect to the treatment. We can also have case control studies that are conducted through these observational platforms. So these are often much more generalizable. So they're on a population basis. They can have improved statistical power because they can be larger. They can have more flexible endpoints, but they are subject to selection bias. So there can often be large differences between the patient characteristics in the different arms, and that then can make it difficult to attribute carefully the outcome to the treatment of interest. So one of the ways that we might get around some of these problems is in having, for example, adaptive design. So one of the concerns, if I just go back to this, this design problem here, and even back further, if we think about the randomized controlled trials, we have to carry those through to the end, and we're not allowed to peak on the way through. So that's often difficult because we want to be able to understand, could we stop this trial early, or could we take off one of the arms of the trial if it's not being very effective? Now, under the classic situation, we wouldn't be allowed to do that. So what we might be able to do is to think about adapting the design. And so there are people like James McGree at QUT and many others that are working in the area of this adaptive design. So you can use the results that are accumulating in the trial to modify a trial's course in accordance with pre-specified setups. So this is often more efficient, more informative, more ethical than trials with a traditional fixed design. So instead of having the design, the conduct, and the analysis, you now can have this adaptation that can occur in the design of the trial. Now, those there are different kinds of changes that you might undertake, and you can see some of these listed on this slide here. And this is a very active area. You need to be careful, though, that you can still undertake these kinds of adaptations and not introduce bias, and still be able to have the statements, the statistical statements about cause and effect. You can see in this slide here some of the adaptive designs that have been developed. And in the reference to Pullman in this paper here, there's some examples of these kinds of trials if you're interested. But you can see here all of the different kinds of adjustments that can be made now to clinical trial setups to make them much more effective in situations that are more like the orthopedic setup. So here are some examples of adaptive design and the efficacy of these kinds of design. So we have, for example, a study looking at re-estimating the sample size on the way through. So at a pre-planned point in the study, some analysis was undertaken. The standard deviation of the outcome of interest was evaluated and found to be much larger than it should have been, so it was expected. And so then they increased the sample size, and the study then was able to demonstrate the outcomes that were intended. If that hadn't happened, then the study would have been underpowered and wouldn't have been effective at all, and it would have been a great loss of resources and patients and so on. In the second example that I have here, you can see that the analysis, the interim analysis, identified futile arms of the study, and then there was enabling the study to continue by focusing on the arms that were actually effective. And so this then led to greater efficiency and so on. So an excellent examples of how this adaptation can work. So now, after talking about that design, I want to talk a bit about randomization. And you can see on the slide here, there's a lot of different kinds of randomization that can be done. Originally, I said we just randomize into the groups. But one of the problems with that, just simple randomization, is we can have uneven distributions in the groups. So the alternatives could be block randomization. And then you can also have, that's a benefit, but also still has some drawbacks. You can then stratify the randomization. So you try to control for covariates like age and gender and comorbidities and other sort of socio-demographic factors that might be important. And then the problem with that is that the patients have to be, or the subjects need to be allocated to the groups ahead of time so that you can balance up these covariates. And often the studies are done sequentially, so that doesn't work either. So you can have this covariate adaptive randomization as well. Now we can take that one step further, and we can look at propensity score matching. So this idea here is where we assume that we have some treatment assignment and some potential outcomes and some covariates. And we want to adjust for these covariates so that they won't bias the relationship we want to make between the treatment and the outcomes. So what we can do then is to construct this propensity score. So every person or every subject will have a score based on those covariates, and we can then match the subjects to with similar scores, and then we can allocate those subjects with similar scores to the different treatment groups. So what we're doing in that case then is we're saying, all right, well, based on this propensity score, which is taking into account all of the covariates, we can then say that these two subjects are similar with respect to all of the covariates that matter. So if we then put them into the two treatment groups and we observe their outcomes, the difference in the outcomes should be because of the treatment and not because of all of those other covariates. So this is the general idea of propensity score matching. And we can see that it's really just a sort of a finer grain stratification compared to the other options that I showed in the previous slide. So here's propensity score matching in a diagram. We take our variable extraction and selection. We look at estimation approaches. So how do we get that propensity score? And then this is where we might do logistic regression, which is the most common approach. There's also non-parametric methods and machine learning methods that we can undertake to get that propensity score. So the probability or the propensity score based on the covariates. We can then apply that propensity score through some matching mechanism, and then we can look at the hypothesis testing based on that. And you can see that that's quite different from the sort of the typical clinical trial approach, going just from the variables through to the hypothesis testing. So a propensity score matching example here, just to show you, is that we compare infant birth weights of mothers who smoked with mothers who didn't. So the first phase is to calculate the propensity scores via logistic regression. The second phase then is to set out those propensity scores you can see along the bottom, and then the birth weight along the vertical axis here, which is the outcome of interest. And then we can look at creating a regression of the birth weight as a function of those propensity scores for each of the groups. So here we have it for the treatment group, the mothers who smoked, the control group, the mothers who didn't, which is the green dash line. And we can see then the difference between the regression line for the mothers who smoked, who didn't smoke, sorry, the green line, versus the birth weight for the mothers who did smoke, adjusting for these propensity scores. So after adjusting for those scores, then there was a substantive difference in the birth weight for these two groups. So this kind of approach then has been, very widely used. It's been extended to more than two groups. Multi-level models have been developed. There's variations on stratification. There's a lot of work on missing data and imputation, a lot of work on extending this to longitudinal studies. So it has become a tenet of the way that we might conduct clinical trials and observational trials. So it's a way to bring both of those kinds of trial setups into the same sort of arena. But there are concerns. And so some of the concerns with propensity scores, and some people even advocate not using them, so it's now a big debate about whether we should go this way, is that this approach only accounts for observable, observable and observed variables. It can increase the bias because of unobserved variables that we're not taking into account in this propensity score. It can increase model imbalance and inefficiency. And the way that we conduct that modeling, whether we use logistic regression or machine learning approaches and so on, and how we do that matching, those choices, as we know as data scientists and statisticians and through our AI training, we know those choices matter. So there's still a lot of work to be done in really tailoring or improving these propensity score matching approaches. And I'll just finish briefly with a statement about this design and adaptive design and the propensity scores, and thinking about also the way that we do adaptive design in experiments and clinical trials is also interesting to think about how we might use that for big data analysis in general. So when we have these large population studies or data in general, if we have a specific question, we don't need to analyze all of it. So we can use these experimental design principles to select the data that we require to answer the question. And so this might be a way of thinking about how to bring our adaptive design and our AI knowledge and the propensity score approaches, think about, well, maybe we don't need to use all of the patients or all of the subjects in a population in order to be able to answer the questions of interest. So we can take a design-theoretic approach to adapting those questions. And if we do that, and I'm happy to show some more examples about that, but in a simple logistic regression setup, if we want to identify the important covariates and get accurate and precise parameters, we can do that through this kind of adaptive design process. And if we do that, then we find that we only need to analyze 3% of the data in order to obtain the outcome of interest. So we might think about using this approach with our clinical trial approaches and our propensity score approaches to really come up with then a data-centric view for clinical trials. And on that note then, I'll just leave you with this. If any of you need some light relief, this is a card game called Trust Me, I'm a Doctor. It has really quack remedies, and you play it and then apply these remedies to somebody's malady that they have. It's a great game just for some light relief, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kerrie. That was fantastic and really interesting talk. And that card game looks quite fun, actually. I might look that up. So we're already getting some questions coming through. So if everyone feel free to type your questions in the chat. We might not get to all of them, but we'll definitely try and forward them on to get them answered for you if we don't. So the first question that we have here is from Peter Yates. He says, with data privacy a huge issue, especially in the health sector, what are the things you need to be careful about in the early stages of data analysis and trials?
Yeah, so data privacy is a huge issue, and something that many groups are working on. I think we also need to recognise that there are ways that we might be able to do the analysis that, as much as we can get to the individual data, then looking at the individual data is really important, because if we look at group data, then sometimes we have this problem of ecological fallacy. You know, what happens at a group level may be very different to what happens at an individual level. So having that individual analysis can be really important for us to understand this cause and effect. Having said that, when we do the analysis at an individual level, doesn't mean that when we release the results, that's going to be at an individual level. So sometimes we may need the data to do the analysis, and then we need all of the structures to make sure that that's kept private. But then the results can be released at a level that preserves privacy. And then what we can look at is doing analysis of those results in a public forum. So what we've got, for example, we've created this Australian Cancer Atlas, and the Australian Cancer Atlas is analysed at the individual level data, but then the results are reported, and you can see it online if you look for Australian Cancer Atlas. The results are reported at a small area level, so they're aggregated results across over 2,000 areas of Australia, where you can see cancer incidence and survival at that level, with a point estimate and an interval. And then you can do some effectively meta-analysis or hierarchical model based on those public results to then look to get more insights into, for example, geographic disparities across the country and so on. So it's only a partial answer, because the question of privacy is a really big one. It really comes down to this balance of needing that information to get the answers that the detail that we need and the insights that we need, but then respecting also that when we put that information out, it has to be so that we don't release the private information.
Yep, excellent. That makes sense. We'll just get one more question out to you. If you can answer it relatively briefly, that would be great. So Owen Forbes says, can you please share your thoughts on how we might accelerate the adoption of adaptive trial design in areas that are hooked to the idea of the RCT, as they are the only gold standard, in order to minimise the number of participants experiencing high burden of disease who end up without hope or treatment when randomised to control a low intervention group?
Yeah, so this is obviously one of the real motivators for having adaptive trials, is because for the patients' protection and so that we can make those decisions early about non-performing arms of the trial. I think the more that we talk about these approaches and the more that we trial them, then the more that they will be accepted. And adaptive trials and adaptive designs are being now accepted by some of the regulatory authorities in the US and in other countries. It's still early days, and so there's some of those kinds of trials don't get proposed because they're more likely to be knocked back. But then the regulators often say we'd be really open to hearing about those kinds of trials because we understand that they can really provide this kind of benefit. And so it's a slow process, but it's happening. And there are some really strong advocates around the world, both from the data science, biostatistical side and from the clinical side, who are promoting this. So we can just keep doing it.
Yep. Fantastic. All right, we'll have to leave it there today. Unfortunately, we could listen to you speak a lot longer, but we're time limited. So thank you again for joining us, Kerrie. Thank you for everyone who posted questions. We will look to getting those answered for you individually. All the best, and look forward to seeing what other interesting research you come up with in the future.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. And AI is just so huge in this area. So anybody who wants to work in it, please let us know.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so we will now hand over to our next speaker, Janet Wiles. So I'll just give you guys a bit of a background on Janet. So she'll be talking to us about getting started with clean and ethical data, which is a great segue from the previous topic that we just listened to. So Professor Janet Wiles is in the School of Information Technology and Electrical Engineering at the University of Queensland. She received a PhD from the University of Sydney. She's research leader of the co-innovation group in UQ's School of Information Technology and Electrical Engineering, and UQ node leader for the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. Her current research projects focus on human-robot interactions, language technologies, bio-inspired computation, visualization, and artificial intelligence. Previous projects have been in complex systems modelling in biology and neuroscience, human memory, language, and cognition. So looking forward to listening to your talk. Take it away, Janet. Thank you. I think you're still on mute there, if we just can't hear you quite yet. But we can see your slides.
Okay.
There we go, we can hear you now.
Okay, and can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you. Right, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Bit of a change of pace. The work I want to talk about is real world data. So this is long before you have enough detail usually for a clinical trial. So when I started talking to Zoran about, the kinds of things that I thought were really critical to talk about for AI, I sent him a sketch an email. So real world data sets rarely come cleanly designed. The first thing teams often need to do is clean the data, identify records that need to be rechecked. And then I kind of thought, actually, the first thing is a crash course in ethics. And so he asked me to talk about this. So what I want to talk about is where ethics hits designers. So this is particularly for people on the AI tech side. This is from a designer's code of ethics from a few years ago. No one wakes up deciding to throw their ethics out the window. One slippery slope at a time. It's a series of small decisions, might seem fine at the time, and before you know it, you're designing filtering UI for the Walmart online gun shop. And this might sound a bit extreme, and some people say, well, I'm not going to end up in a job like that. And ethics will be done by the ethicists. I'm going to get clean data. I'm going to, work on things that are ethical. And I was talking to one of the occupational therapists and one of the best ethicists in the area of dementia tech I know, Jackie Little. And Jackie pointed out that the first person to go to jail in the Volkswagen diesel cheating case was the algorithm designer. I think it's really worthwhile thinking about what it means to send the software engineer to jail. So For people who are not particularly aware of this, Volkswagen used sophisticated algorithms to shut down their pollution controls on millions of diesel automobiles when they weren't being tested. So to make it appear that the cars were environmentally friendly, they put in specific software. The first person sentenced to jail was the engineer. He went to jail he was sentenced for 40 months. He didn't actually benefit personally apart from his salary, but the judge in the case said he was too loyal to the automaker he'd worked for, who was a German citizen since the 1980s, and unwilling to expose its deceptive practices or walk away from his reasonably lucrative job. It turned out over time that the entire team was in on it, and over 7 people have been prosecuted since then from the team. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about what it means to be working in a position where you impact things like the environmental health of the planet or, close to home, the human health. So personally, I think ethics is not a spectator sport. It's not something you can leave to other people in the team. And most of us assume someone else is working on it. All the tech people I know, I'm a computer scientist by training, and so all the tech people I know would like the people who collect the data and the people who deploy the software to be the ones who really look into the ethics. But I think we've got over 100 people here on this webinar. And so I'd like you to think about ethical issues in health tech if you haven't worked in health before, health if you haven't worked with tech before. Have you had to make a decision yourself about an ethical dilemma relating to health technology? Or if you haven't actually made a decision yourself, think about a turning point for yourself in your understanding of ethics and tech. If it's an example that can be ethically shared, and remember that this is a public forum, so there are some things about other people and data sets and that will be private and you can't share them. But if you can share it, sketch the dilemma and drop it into the Zoom chat. And what we'd like to do is collect these and discuss them at the end. Okay. So good intentions and wicked reality are what often happen in things like datathons like this. So your team, you get put in a team, you've got cross-disciplinary experience in health, AI, data science, machine learning, you might have robotic skills. What you're expecting, what you would like is that the data sets will be clean, ethically acquired. You can tick that off as done, you would like. Your project will help healthcare benefit from AI, and you're ready to get going. The wicked reality is that most healthcare data that has not been publicly released or curated in some way is incomplete. There are basic level data entry errors that might or might not impact on it. The number of records that are relevant to what you're analysing, you'd like to be in the tens of thousands, but actually by the time you clean out all the incompleteness and everything else, it's often in the tens. The database can be poorly designed. Often there's no user interface, and your collaborators are busy and you can't even get to meet with them, is what sometimes happens. Okay, so I want to show you a particular analysis that I did. This is more than 10 years ago. It's stroke health data. So this is a project that went on for about 20 years. It's in the US. This is not publicly available data, so I'm not going to show you the real data here. The question that was underlining this project was, what is the relationship between the neurological impairment caused by a stroke and the lived experience that people have in everyday life? So there are measures of neurological impairment. The NIH stroke scale is one of them. And if you boil this down to what it looks like as a visualization or as a statistical analysis, you can say, if you look on the left there, you've got the measures in hospital, so the NIH stroke scale, you've got experience at home, and there are a whole variety of different tests that they had done. The expected relationship is that your experience at home is good when the impairment in hospital is low. So there's a linear relationship, and it turned out that that was borne out by the data. There were over 10,000 records, more than 500 variables, so not all of them were relevant. They were collected by more than 20 different health professionals in dozens of different studies, people interested at different times, dropping in and out of the project. Quite a messy database in some ways, but a phenomenal resource for the hospital involved. So after working with this data for a while, yes, you've got an expected relationship, but it's not necessarily what's going to be valuable. So if you look on the right, this graph is a visualization of the kinds of questions that people were interested in. So you can think of the measures in hospital as what's good or bad in hospital. So 0 is good, the highest score to the right would be bad. And then at home, you can ask how well are people doing at home. And this boiled down to a conversation over many years between what the neurologist knew in the hospital, and the neurologist never got to see the patients after they went home, and then what the occupational therapists, the OTs, know because they work with the patients at home. And what is obvious in this graph, but was not obvious at the time, so in a good hospital, they tend to have good scores at home. But it turns out there are people who have good scores in hospital, they go home and they do very poorly at home. And it was this group, particularly, that the OTs were interested in. And so visualizations can be very powerful for helping conversation even between the medical specialists themselves or the health workers themselves. This is not something that requires deep learning. We use the actual data in this particular case, and the OT was using it at international conferences to say, this is something that is of concern to our field. Okay, so this particular data set, that was kind of the end of the story. But in the beginning, we started out a fairly messy data set collected over many years. The team sent an email, the healthcare team in the US sent us an email at one stage saying they know that the data is messy. What they'd like to know is it worthwhile putting effort into cleaning the early years of data, which were incomplete because a lot of data wasn't collected. It's known to be noisy. They'd like us to suggest a cutoff point, probably around 2003-04, and they will aim to have all the data since then up to a very high standard. What we had discovered at the early stages was that over 90% of some of the tests had metadata entered but no content. So it looked like everyone was doing perfectly, but when you look at it, it's only perfect because all the scores were 0. So to look at this is something that I would suggest is well worthwhile doing in any data set that you're looking at, is have a look at the completeness. So the graph here on the left is the completion percentage, and the best was 70%. It varies enormously over the years, and that depends on who's in the project, who entered the data. These are not all data errors. Some of the studies. And then on the right, you can look at something at a bit more of a detail, which is these are data anomalies. So you've got a numerical record, a numerical variable, and it's got a non-numerical figure in it, or something that's meant to be yes or no, and it's got a number from 1 to 10. So it's useful to have a look over time. And what the graph on the right shows you is that actually they used 3 different interfaces over the 10 years, and the different interfaces had different error rates, induced errors from the interfaces themselves. So it's worthwhile just having a look and saying, well, what can you do to visualize the data you've got and really look at the data itself? So the most powerful question I think data scientists can ask when you work across disciplinary boundaries is, what would you really like to know from your data? And this is a quote, good visualization can help users explore and understand data, and also to communicate that understanding to others. So we worked with Queensland Health Emergency Bed Management. People asked us, it was a visualization study. We did over 20 different visualizations. And the interesting thing was that everyone we talked to in the system liked a different visualization. And they told us we could create the visualizations for them, but then they had to interpret what it meant in their context. So visualizations actually become part of a communication across disciplinary boundaries. So if you can expose what you think you see in the data, and your collaborators, your team members can come back and say, well, actually, here's what's going on. The other work we've done is visualizing human communication, where we're looking at both a visualization of turn-taking, doctor-patient interactions, and then metrics to quantify what people talk about. Okay, so I want to turn to data ethics. The Brookings Institute has done, how to address AI ethical dilemmas. There's a reference here. The growing sophistication and ubiquity of AI applications has raised a number of ethical concerns. These include issues of bias, fairness, safety, transparency, and accountability. Those of you who are computer scientists, you'll know XKCD, the cartoonist. This is a cartoon from several years ago, and one of the people is asking, so this is your machine learning system? Yep, you pour the data into this big pile of linear algebra, you collect the answers on the other side. What if the answers are wrong? Well, stir up the pile until they start to look right. There are big data researchers who never look at the data at all. They just assume that there will be so much data that if there's noise or errors in the data will, it will eventually be corrected. And I think in the kind of work we do with Queensland Health, and we also work with a variety of different communities, Aboriginal communities, people living with dementia, children, people with autism. If the answers are wrong, it's quite often because the people who are involved in the condition are not involved in the data collection or curation. And so these issues of bias, fairness, safety, transparency, and accountability are things you should be asking yourself. So Ethics 101, and this is just the one slide that if nothing else in ethics, I think needs to be understood, is do not cause harm, and that people designing technology can assume that nothing they do will cause harm because technology is neutral and the harm comes from other people. But I don't think that's true. And I think the design field is coming to an understanding that it's not. So ask the questions, could what I'm creating cause harm, and how does it impact on people's lives? And if you don't know, then have a conversation with people who do. So one of the things about working for Volkswagen, working for large tech companies, developing a startup, you have the power to choose not to work on data sets or not to automate processes. There's a quote here from a report on analysis of people's expectations following Barack Obama's presidency. And a lot of people expected things to change, and they didn't. They did change somewhat, but they didn't change as much as people expected. They expected things to be solved. And the comment was, racism is not just intentional discrimination, it's also the unintentional leaving behind of others. And this is something that in AI and in technology is all too easy to do. Because if we look under the lamppost, if we look for things that are easy to do, if we start using speech-to-text systems that have already been created, then the people whose data were fed into that will probably be well served, and a lot of other people will be left behind. But this is just saying a similar sort of thing. It's inherently, it's an inherently ethical activity. So I work with the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. There's a variety of different tech development. I'm going to introduce you to just a couple of those. The first one is around language technology. And if you think we've got 7,000 languages in the world, at least 3,000 have some written tradition, which tells you that 4,000 possibly don't. Almost all of these are supported by Unicode, which is the way of encoding written data so that computers can operate on it. There are a lot of different keyboards available, and speech recognition for about 120 of those 7,000 languages, and text-to-speech for even fewer. So if you look at the Australian continent, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages in Australia, we have, depending on how you count, anything from hundreds, a few hundred up to thousands of languages and dialects How many of these have speech-to-text systems that are supported by Google? None, not a single one of them. So the question is, what can we do about this? One would be just to get the data. But a lot of communities do not want to share their data. They don't want to share their languages. One of the things you learn when you work with Aboriginal communities is that language is not something that belongs to the whole world. It belongs to the community, it belongs to the land. And in some cases, it's not spoken except on country. Okay, so how do you help people or work with people or collaborate with people when the tools that you would typically use are not available? So automatic speech recognition is pretty straightforward. You get training data, an acoustic model, a lexicon, a language model, you build your ASR system. There are systems like Caldi, which are open source, which are already out there. So one of the things that we think is really important is to try and put these tools in the hands of users themselves. So put them in the hands of linguists who work with Aboriginal communities. Ultimately, we'd like them in the hands of language workers themselves. So we ran a workshop, and in fact, some of the people who are here at this hackathon may have been at the Google workshop when Dan Vanesh, who's in the centre there, gave a talk, and then we had a week-long workshop building a speech-to-text system. So 25-person multidisciplinary team built a speech-to-text system for a Bui, which is an Indonesian language. We used that one because the data was available in 4 days. That doesn't mean it's really high quality. There's still a lot of work to be done. This has turned into a project over time, building user interface so that it's much easier to use. Student projects. We've been working with Boeing on code reviews. There've been over 6 workshops internationally to teach people how to use the ELPIS system. And one of the things the team members are doing at the moment is planning a language text special topics course starting in August at UQ, and we're hoping that that will then become available in a wider community. Okay, so switching to robotics, which is an area where I do a lot of work in social robots. The promise of natural language in robots, there's fiction and fact. A lot of our ideas come from media, but in practice, robots in hospitals. So this is a picture of Anne Elvin with a robot in Townsville Hospital. You would think speech to text could work pretty well in a system like this. The problem is hospitals are very noisy places. So in the end, they couldn't use speech to text at all in this particular case. And so the robot would speak to people and they would interact back using the tablet. We actually wondered how well speech to text systems, the commercial speech to text systems would work. We've been asked, could we do satisfaction surveys in health? And so we started doing satisfaction surveys on non-health issues, so games, just to see how well a robot can actually pick up on language. So we created a standard language pipeline. This is done based around the Harley system, which was developed by David Ireland at CSIRO in collaboration with so for the OP robots that we work with. And this is the result I wanted to show you. This is word counts. Have a look at what's in blue. These are correct word counts. So the most frequent word was I. It gets it right most of the time. What's in orange are the incorrect word counts. And the two that I think are, have been really highlighted on the left there is no and yes. So it turns out that the system in answering surveys was pretty good when people said yes. But when people said no, more than half the time, it couldn't recognize the word no. They would say no, no, no. I mean no. Oh, bugger it. All right, yes. And they would end up changing their answers. And we found the same when they were doing ratings. So a rating of 8 out of 10 or 4 out of 10, people would end up changing their ratings. So one of the things that's really quite interesting when you're dealing with these is the kinds of errors that turn up in practice. Now, this was in a very quiet lab with just one person and a robot. If you were trying to do this in a noisy setting, say Anne's setting in the hospital, there is a lot more complications. The other thing to be aware of if you're going to be using some of the commercial speech is that these sorts of speech-to-text systems send data to America and back in many cases, and you cannot transmit voice without permission. So if you're building in speech systems, just be aware of that. We also work with people living with dementia, technology that can empower everyday lives. And one of the things we've been doing is doing human-centered co-design, where we have an expert reference group who are people who are living with dementia. Now, we've been told people living with dementia cannot be participants, they can't be co-authors on our papers, they can't present at conferences. It turns out that when you've met one person with dementia, you've met one person with dementia. Some are tech savvy, some are not. Everyone's different, it changes over time. And so this particular project has been designing technology that people want. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and move on to the questions. But I want to acknowledge that the group, the social technologies teams at UQ have been working with Opal Robots, Elpis is our speech-to-text system, Discursus, and a whole variety of other projects. That it's taken a huge team of students, researchers, collaborators at all different levels. And I'd like to hand over back to Steph and the questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Janet. That was a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Lots to think about there. I'm sure we have lots of questions. So feel free to post any questions in the chat. I think something that I was thinking of as I was listening to you speak is when you're talking about biases and that quote you shared there that was very interesting is it's often unintentional. You know, there is research that if you have a diverse team working on creating a tool, you can also prevent some of those biases from occurring, which is, you know, something we also want to focus on with the Datathon. You know, that's why we want diversity, not only when you're looking at culture and other backgrounds, but even in experience. So clinicians and then data scientists coming together, you know, if we have people from all different backgrounds, they can bring to the table some of those important issues and highlight those that may not be obvious to others. Do you have thoughts on that? Do you think that that holds true, or are there other, you know, guidelines we need to use to sort of avoid these biases in an unethical way?
Yeah, so I think having a diverse group of team members is a good idea. Some of the things that we've learnt working with people living with dementia, they are our experts. And we tend to forget that a lot of the people coming together in these teams actually have salaries and are paid. So we actually pay our experts. We pay our consultants, and we pay them at the rate we would pay a consultant at the university. So it's really worthwhile thinking, what are you expecting? Are you doing this for them? In which case you expect them to be grateful and work for nothing. Or are you collaborating with them and their expertise is really contributing to the viability? So one of the things you quite often find in education, in other communities, is that you think there's something that would be useful. When you actually get to work with teachers or, you know, different groups, you'll discover that that's not the thing that would really help them. That's not where their problems lie. So tools, one of the tools we use is the value proposition canvas, which is a way of, it's a design tool for getting at what are the real pains in someone's job. So you can start by saying, what are the pains? If you what would the gains be? And you can have a conversation between what is possible now versus, you know, what could that solution do? So in AI, there are all sorts of things we can do now that we never thought we could do. And asked us, could you create this? So part of that conversation is where is the pain?
Yep.
With the problems, and then what kinds of solutions? I think also one of the things we've found is that it's easy to create high-level tech that only works for the duration of the project. If you want to stay in the community after you've left, it's got to be, I read a phrase recently, it's got to be boring tech. It's got to be established. It's got to be things that people already know or can learn really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that there's a lot of, if you're using innovations, things that aren't established, then they probably won't be used in real tech for 3 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a really good point, because I think we can sort of, when we're in this space, rush to create very new and exciting tools, but thinking about the usability, and if you do have a new tool, how are you going to educate and support the community and to continue to use those tools? So yeah, fantastic. So we are at time now, so we'll need to leave it there. But again, thank you so much for an excellent talk. We'll see if anyone has a response to the question that Janet posed there. That would be fantastic. We see one from Kelvin there. We'll forward that on. This webinar will be recorded, has been recorded and will be posted along with the slides. So we'll send that out to everyone who is registered, so you can watch it again if you like, or forward it on to anyone. And we do have another session on Friday. That's at 4 p.m. and we're going to have a panel session. So we'll have some interesting discussions there. Again, you can find out more at the Queensland AI Hub website. But that's all for today. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Janet. We'll look forward to seeing what research you have coming out in the future. So signing off for now. Have a good afternoon, everyone.